Todas y todos, damos la bienvenida a esta conferencia internacional que organiza el Seminario Feminismo y Comunicación, que encabeza aquí la doctora Aime Vega y con quien hemos tenido gusto de compartir muchos años ya y que ha formado muchas generaciones además. Este seminario se imparte en el programa del posgrado en Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de esta facultad y esta conferencia está en coorganización con la División de Estudios de Posgrado, que tiene a su cargo el Programa Único de Especializaciones en Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, que coordino. Y pues les damos pues la más cordial bienvenida. Este día vamos a abordar el doctor Cees Hamelink, este conferencista internacional muy reconocido que tenemos aquí el honor de tener en nuestra facultad en la UNAM. Nos va a hablar sobre los desafíos del derecho a comunicar. Los temas que abordará serán censura, vigilancia, propaganda y perspectivas de la realización de los derechos humanos. Nos acompaña la doctora Aime Vega y también Gabriela Ramos, quienes nos ayudarán un poco con la traducción. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. También quisiera leerles un parrafito sobre una entrevista que encontré sobre el doctor y dice: Cees Hamelink ha sido catedrático de comunicación internacional durante un cuarto de siglo y desde su jubilación en la Universidad de Ámsterdam lleva 10 años enseñando sobre cultura, religión, derechos humanos y salud pública en la VU, la British University. Inclasificable como lo es en su bagaje académico, su formación teológica, periodismo y filosofía, tiene al individuo como un elemento vertebrador, al ser humano como el contador de historias que va escribiendo la suya propia, mientras se afana por vivir en una sociedad cada vez más compleja y acelerada. Autor de varios libros y asiduo comentarista en la televisión holandesa, ha reaparecido en el último año para alertar de la falta de pensamiento crítico en torno a las medidas implementadas para combatir la pandemia, esto en el 2020. Algo que le atribuye a la precariedad de los medios de comunicación, mensajeros que han perdido la capacidad de cuestionar al poder y de mirar con los ojos bien abiertos. Bueno, cedo la palabra y disfruten esta conferencia.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días. Muchas gracias al posgrado, a nuestra facultad, por albergar la conferencia que encabezará el día de hoy el doctor Cees Hamelink. Mi nombre es Aime Vega Montiel. Tengo el gusto de conocer a varios de ustedes y a todo el seminario de posgrado en feminismo y comunicación de nuestro posgrado. Pues bueno, como lo hemos comentado con parte de la audiencia que está hoy aquí presente, el enfoque y la base de la investigación en comunicación que desarrollamos la mayoría de quienes trabajamos con grupos sociales como son mujeres, jóvenes, niñas, niños, migrantes, etcétera, es la base de los derechos humanos. Y tenemos el honor y el privilegio de contar el día de hoy con el doctor Cees Hamelink, quien, no es que me atreva a decirlo, es que es así, es quien probablemente ha teorizado más a nivel mundial y eso en la historia de la construcción de nuestra agenda de investigación sobre el vínculo entre los derechos humanos y en particular aquellos que vinculan la comunicación, el derecho humano a comunicar. Traigo conmigo un libro que es de acceso abierto. En México, nuestra universidad fue la sede de la Conferencia Internacional de la International Association for Media and Communication Research, de la IMCR, de la cual el doctor Cees Hamelink fue presidente. Y justo el tema que dio lugar a los trabajos que llevamos a cabo ahí fue el de comunicación y derechos humanos. Lo que vemos en esta obra, que además es una obra bilingüe, está traducida al inglés y al español, es cómo la agenda es muy amplia y cómo todos los temas que trabajamos, aunque los veamos lejanos, vinculan el respeto a la dignidad humana. Entonces, pues bueno, como ya lo señaló mi colega, la maestra Carolina Pacheco Luna, a quien le agradezco muchísimo todo su apoyo en las gestiones para poder realizar esta conferencia, lo mismo a la doctora Mónica Amilpas desde la unidad de género de nuestra facultad. El abordaje del doctor Hamelink incluirá temas que están a debate y que son harto problemáticos en la actualidad, como tiene que ver el discurso de odio, la desinformación y la manipulación en el contexto del ecosistema digital. Así que sin más, bueno, le damos la bienvenida al doctor Cees Hamelink. Él hablará, Cees, you are really welcome. Thank you so much. Él hablará en inglés, entonces junto con la maestra Gabriela Barrios iremos haciendo sus intervenciones para traducir las principales ideas del doctor, aunque asumimos que aquí toda la audiencia entiende perfectamente el inglés, ¿verdad? Sí, a ver, levantemos la mano quienes no tenemos problema con el inglés. Ya, toda la audiencia. Entonces, Cees, the floor is yours. Yeah. The floor is yours. Please go ahead. Thank you so much. ¿Perdón? Gaby, ¿te quieres?
It seemed to me appropriate in the context of feminismo y comunicación to dedicate this lecture to two women, two independent, strong-willed, bloody-minded, tough cookies, Eleanor Roosevelt and my younger sister who died 2 days ago. Eleanor Roosevelt brought us the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when I asked her secretary, Professor Humphrey, what kind of woman she was, he said she was a tough cookie. And also my sister was a tough cookie. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt did something very special. She handed us a document which is probably the most beautiful document of the 20th century, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah. Nos dice el doctor Cees Hamelink que él quiere dedicar la conferencia del día de hoy a dos mujeres maravillosas, a Eleanor Roosevelt, quien es quien redactó la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos. Nos dice el profesor Cees Hamelink que eso, de acuerdo con el secretario de Naciones Unidas, Eleanor tenía eso, un carácter muy fuerte, y también dedica esta conferencia a su hermana menor, quien falleció hace 2 días, y el doctor Cees Hamelink identifica a su hermana también eso como una mujer con una personalidad fuerte y transformadora. Así que nos unimos a esta dedicación que hace Cees a tu hermana.
There is an anecdote about how we got this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1945, the world was going to be redivided between the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. And that was done on Yalta in a meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And 50 years later, there was a conference in my country, which I had the privilege of moderating, with the 3 grandsons. Now imagine, the grandson of Stalin, the grandson of Churchill, and the grandson of Roosevelt came together to talk about that conference where their grandfathers decided the future of the world. And I said to the 3 guys, listen, those were your grandfathers. What would have happened if your grandmothers had been at Yalta? How would they have dealt with the world? Now, this was a difficult question because Stalin had just murdered his last wife, and Churchill was usually so drunk that he didn't recognize his wife. So the only one who could give an answer was the grandson of Roosevelt. And Roosevelt says, my grandmother was packing her suitcase. And the president says, Eleanor, what are you doing? And she says, well, I'm packing my suitcase because I'm coming with you to Yalta. And then the president said, no way. You're far too strong a woman. If you would come with me, you would single-handedly decide the future of the world. You stay home. And I always think that as revenge for having to stay home, she made the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Bueno, es una historia preciosa, resumida, que por cierto está en su libro más reciente, porque yo estuve leyendo ayer para venir a esta conferencia, eso que nos sintetiza lo que fue el detonador de la redacción de la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos, que hace un momento olvidé comentar. De acuerdo con el profesor Cees Hamelink, y estamos de acuerdo en eso, se trata del documento más precioso y más perfecto que nos hemos dado la humanidad para asentar un pacto de respeto a la dignidad entre seres humanos en nuestra historia. Entonces, lo que nos dice el profesor Hamelink, que en intercambio con los nietos de Churchill, de Roosevelt y de Stalin, en particular el nieto de Eleanor Roosevelt, él narra cómo es que el hecho, la determinación de su abuela de acompañar a su abuelo en la esfera pública fue determinante para que ella hiciera de la declaración la plataforma en la que se ha constituido, y que definitivamente el hecho de ser mujer fue fundamental para darle a esta declaración la perspectiva que se logró que tuviera.
Now, what makes this declaration, which, remember, the tough cookie got the Universal Declaration against the will of her own government. The United States government never wanted to have a Universal Declaration on human rights. And she managed to pull it off. And she created a document that has three main features. It is inclusive. For the first time in world history, everyone is included. Those rights are for everyone. No one is excluded. All people matter. The second characteristic is it's supranational. Normally, it was that governments decided about how they would treat their citizens, whether they would imprison them or whether they would torture them. And the Universal Declaration says, no, this is no longer up to governments. This is up to all of us. So if anywhere in the world someone sees human rights violated, it is our moral obligation for all of us to intervene. And thirdly, it's a universal document. It is universally valid across cultures, across religions. That is a contested issue still up until today, because you will also probably meet in this university the postmodern relativists. And whenever you meet a professor who is a postmodern relativist, I would say, stay away, run away. Those are dangerous, because they think that human rights depend upon specific cultures. So if in a culture it is normally to beat up women, that should be allowed because it's part of the culture. I once had a meeting with the Indonesian Minister of Foreign Affairs. It's 1993. And he says, I think universal rights are dependent upon our culture, my Indonesian culture. And I said, Your Excellency, I beg to differ. And what you should do, you should go to East Timor and ask the women who have been raped by your soldiers, and ask the people who lost their sons, who were tortured by the Indonesian army. Ask them whether they think torture and rape is part of Indonesian culture, or whether these should be universal values. The victim test is always the best. Don't ask political leaders. Don't ask governments. Ask the victims of human rights violations whether they think these rights are universal or related to culture.
Ok. Lo que nos platica, lo que nos comparte el profesor Hamelink es que Estados Unidos no quería tener una declaración, y tomemos en cuenta entonces Eleanor Roosevelt es quien la hizo posible. Ella se aseguró de lograr un documento que cumpliera con tres características. En primer lugar, ser inclusivo. Por primera vez, todo el mundo, toda la humanidad fue incluida en un instrumento proveniente de Naciones Unidas. En segundo lugar, que sea supranacional, que fuera supranacional. ¿Esto qué quiere decir? Fue un mensaje muy poderoso a los gobiernos para señalarles cómo tenían que tratar a sus ciudadanos, porque hasta antes de la existencia de la declaración eran los gobiernos los que determinaban eso, las reglas del tratamiento a su ciudadanía. Y en tercer lugar, y muy importante, que fuera universal. La declaración entonces va más allá o no se ciñe a contextos culturales específicos, contextos religiosos. Antes de la existencia de la declaración o de la creación de la declaración, se pensaba que los derechos humanos dependían de las culturas locales, de las culturas determinadas. Lo que permitió la declaración fue contar con un piso mínimo que nos mostrara a la humanidad de qué trata el respeto a la dignidad de las personas. Entonces, pone el ejemplo el doctor de prácticas en países como Indonesia, como India. Yo pensaba, por ejemplo, en prácticas como la ablación, el matrimonio infantil, ¿no? Como en países donde se defienden y son legítimas estas prácticas, justo la declaración es la que nos ha permitido intervenir y denunciar esas prácticas como violaciones a la dignidad de los derechos humanos, a la dignidad humana. Entonces, esta parte me parece muy importante entenderla. ¿Qué significa que como humanidad contemos con este piso mínimo de reconocimiento a lo que es la dignidad humana?
At the heart of the Universal Declaration is the article about which we are discussing today, Article 19. And both MA and I are very proud to know that we are members of this international association, and the founding fathers of the IORI, the International Association for Media and Communication Research, were the ones who drafted this Article 19. It's the article on the freedom of information.
Okay, let me explain. En el corazón de la declaración, y esto es lo que compete al trabajo que hacemos en esta universidad y en esta facultad, se encuentra el artículo 19, que es el que sienta las bases para el reconocimiento del derecho a comunicar. El artículo 19 expresa y define lo que es la libertad de expresión, y debemos decir que los fundadores de la Asociación Internacional de Estudios e Investigación en Comunicación está la IMCR, de la cual el doctor Cees Hamelink, ya dijimos, fue presidente, yo fui vicepresidenta. Son 3 investigadores, es decir, 3 académicos. De ahí pensemos en la trascendencia que tiene nuestro trabajo, los que redactaron este artículo de la declaración.
Article 19 has 5 components. First, there is the freedom of expression, to express your opinions freely. Second, there is the freedom to have opinions within your head, just what you're thinking. You're totally free to think whatever you want to think. Thirdly, there is the right to collect information. This was the result of the major news agencies after the World War, who wanted to be free to send journalists around the world to collect information. The fourth was the right to receive information. That was important because during the Second World War, for example, in my country, Los Países Bajos, we were not allowed to listen to the BBC. The Germans, the Nazis controlled whatever we could listen to. And fifth, there was the right to impart, to distribute information. Now, let me briefly talk about these 5 components and also explain why they are under threat today.
Okay. El doctor Hamelink identifica 5 componentes de la libertad de expresión. Ojo, tomen nota porque vamos a hacer examen. Entonces, el primero es el derecho a expresar opiniones. El segundo, el derecho a tener opiniones. El tercero, el derecho a recibir opiniones, o sea, eso, nuestro derecho de acceso a la información. En cuarto lugar, el derecho a recolectar información y el quinto, el derecho a difundir información. Y nos cuenta el doctor Cees Hamelink cómo en Holanda la ciudadanía tenía prohibido consumir la BBC por mandato de los nazis. Es decir, y no estamos hablando de eso hace un siglo, estamos hablando de hace apenas algunas décadas. Y aquí lo importante es que tomemos conciencia de que los derechos nunca debemos darlos por sentados. Una vez que los conquistamos, como dice Simón de Beauvoir, nuestra responsabilidad es vigilarlos porque estamos atendiendo a retrocesos muy graves de los cuales nos va a hablar ahora el doctor Cees. Adelante, Cees.
Freedom of expression. It is particularly important that we talk about that today. Because I want you to realize that today is the last chance of a journalist, Julian Assange, who has spent more than 1,000 days in a high security prison in the UK. Today he stands for the British Supreme Court. And it is his last chance not to be extradited to the United States of America. If Julian would be extradited to the US, he will most likely die in prison. He will be sentenced under a very strange act, the US Espionage Act. And he will be sentenced because basically he is a journalist. The only thing he did was that he exposed the secrets of the state. He exposed the war crimes that the United States committed in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that is a dangerous thing for a journalist to expose the secrets of the state, the Ghana Imperii, as they are called, that may cost you your life. So today is very, very important for all journalists in the world. Well, if Julian gets convicted, then that will be a warning for all journalists. Stay away from the secrets, accept censorship by the Espionage Act of the United States, because the US will go after you wherever you are in the world and will try to get you in prison. So that kind of censorship is extremely dangerous for the freedom of expression. And that's why this is such a special day.
Sí, bueno, además, ahora hablándonos de los desafíos para estas 5 dimensiones, estos 5 componentes del derecho a la libertad de expresión, señala el doctor Hamelink que hoy es un día muy importante. Eso lo sabemos que Julian Assange, un periodista que reveló los crímenes de guerra cometidos por el gobierno de Estados Unidos en Irán y Afganistán y que los expuso públicamente, así como comunicaciones secretas de Estado, está esperando una sentencia que puede significar que su asesinato, iba a decir su muerte, pero no es su muerte, su asesinato por exponer la verdad. Y nos dice el doctor Cees Hamelink, la gravedad que esto representa, eso debe despertarnos la conciencia acerca de que si esta sentencia mandata que Julian Assange sea llevado a los Estados Unidos y que muera en prisión, esta sentencia tendrá repercusiones para el ejercicio de la libertad de expresión de periodistas en todo el mundo. And I must say that this is the current situation in this country for journalists all over México. Y lo que le digo al doctor Assange es que en México actualmente lo sabemos, el ejercicio de la libertad de expresión y el trabajo periodístico está en grave riesgo en todo el país, justamente debido a las mismas causas por las que Julian Assange está siendo sentenciado.
Now, this is very interesting because now I'm going to get into discussion with my moderator and translator because I wholeheartedly disagree. I've been in many countries of the world, and I find very few countries where journalists are so free as in Mexico presently. I've been in Mexico for many years over the past and had met several of your very dubious presidents, like I had tea with President Echeverria. Now, under him, there was no press freedom at all, neither under Salinas, nor under under this strange Coca-Cola guy who was called Fox. So I think, but this is later on for the discussion. But
Es que esta discusión es para las cervezas. I must say that during this period, 43 journalists have been murdered in the
not
country.
by the government. Not by
Okay,
the government.
we will discuss it later
Okay,
with a beer.
In the past, they would be killed by the government.
Discutiremos con una cerveza en medio si les parece. No estoy aquí promoviendo dentro de la universidad, ¿ok?
There's no
Vamos todo el grupo acá.
There's no protest from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and they know best. If a journalist would be killed in this country by the government, there would be a big alarm. But there is not. Anyway, it's a difficult issue. I mean, I want you to realize that the freedom of information means that I'm free to say things that you don't want to hear. Now, that is difficult because imagine you have power. Imagine you are the president or a judge or a police officer. Why would you allow me to say things that you don't want to hear? You must be of great moral maturity to allow people to say nasty things about you. So that's why freedom of information, it's a contested issue. Freedom of opinion will, I think, forever be, we will always disagree on it. And that's why it's such an important issue. It's a moral challenge. But then go to the freedom of holding opinions. Why is that in the Universal Declaration? Well, that is because during the Second World War, both the Germans and the Japanese engaged widely in brainwashing. They were using propaganda. And of course, particularly the German propaganda led by Dr. Joseph Goebbels was extremely effective. As a result of that propaganda, more than 6 million Jews were killed in a genocide. Propaganda brainwashing is always the beginning of genocide, like we see now also in the Middle East. And the Universal Declaration says that is absolutely prohibited. I can't get into your mind. If you say things, I can argue with it, but I have no right to try to look into your head, what you're thinking, because your thoughts are absolutely free. And the remarkable thing is that that right is even later after the declaration become part of international law. And those of you who have studied law know what that means. Jus cogens, binding law. A law that is always valid. Even in the state, even if the state is in danger, you are free to think what you want to think. And I would hope, because propaganda has a political dimension, it's used to assassinate characters or public figures. And all of us who have been in the public domain have suffered from character assassination. It's a very effective way to offend people, to dehumanize people. But there's also a commercial component. I would really want that one of these brilliant students of you, Carolina and Aimee, writes a dissertation on why advertising is a basic violation of your human right to hold opinions. Commercial propaganda, day after day, on television, on billboards, tries to get into your mind and tries to get you to buy things that you don't need. It's manipulation. And it is prohibited. It's prohibited by international law. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you write a dissertation on that? I would be very happy to see that book.
Entonces, continuando con los desafíos al derecho a la libertad de expresión, relacionado con este principio del derecho, que es el derecho a tener opiniones, señala el doctor Cees Hamelink que históricamente es un principio que se ha visto amenazado y en particular él destaca el papel de la propaganda en su dimensión política. Eso cómo la propaganda ha jugado históricamente un papel, ha sido un mecanismo que intenta influir en la mente de los ciudadanos. Veíamos esta semana justo esta idea de la aguja hipodérmica y toda la perspectiva funcionalista de los efectos, que eso, cómo se estudia, la causa por la que se empieza a estudiar a los medios es justo por la preocupación que existe acerca de su poder de influir en la mente de la ciudadanía. Pero también destaca el doctor Hamelink la dimensión comercial de la propaganda, que tiene estas mismas características. Lo que busca es influir en la mente de la ciudadanía. Lo hemos comentado también en el seminario, lo hemos comentado en clase, cómo incluso estas grandes corporaciones utilizan conceptos asociados a los derechos humanos o que hemos construido en el marco de los derechos humanos, como puede ser autonomía, empoderamiento, pero los vacían de densidad política y lo que hacen en cambio es a través de esos discursos o de esos conceptos vendernos productos y al mismo tiempo despolitizar o quitarle la densidad política a esta conceptualización de derechos humanos.
The third component, the right to collect information, that is increasingly under threat because it means that journalists should be free to travel around the world and get information, for example, about conflicts. But it is extremely difficult to collect information, for example, about a conflict between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians. It's equally enormously different for journalists to collect information about the conflict in Eastern Europe between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Why is it so difficult? Because governments don't want journalists to know what's really happening. So they find all kinds of tricks by which journalists will never go to the real sources. In the Iraq and Afghanistan war, that was called embedding. You embed journalists, you allow them to report, but you allow them to report under the leadership of the military. So as a journalist, you have to travel with the military, and you only can collect the stories that the military tell you. Like if you want to report about Israel and Gaza, you are dependent upon the news services of the Israeli Defense Forces. And one of the problems in conflicts is that all parties lie. So how are you going to deal with that as a journalist? I mean, in the Middle East conflict, the Israelis lie and the Hamas people lie. In the Eastern European conflict, of course, Zelensky lies, Joe Biden lies, Putin lies. They're all lying. That's normally in a conflict. So as a journalist, it's extremely difficult to get good information. And it's increasingly made difficult also because it's dangerous. Now, when I was a journalist, foreign correspondent in the Middle East in the 1960s. I was probably there before most of you were born. And reporting about that was dangerous and sometimes very discouraging if you went on a mission like I did with the BBC colleague in the south of Lebanon and he was killed. So you need a lot of whiskey that evening in your hotel to deal with that. And it's questionable whether you go again the next day. You take enormous risk, and those risks are even more today, because today many parties shoot deliberately at journalists. And as journalists, we were never really targets. You had bad luck if you stepped on a landmine or when you were killed. When you were a cameraman. Cameramen were always the most at risk because you carry this big camera and from a distance you can't see whether it's a camera or a bazooka. So the enemy thinks, better first kill him and then find out whether it's a camera or not. But that's different from what happens today. all over the world. Journalists get killed, but they get deliberately killed. Governments are after them.
Ok. El tercer desafío tiene que ver con el principio del derecho a recolectar la información, es decir, a buscar la información, y esto toca directamente el trabajo periodístico. Nos dice el doctor Cees Hamelink, el trabajo para los periodistas está constantemente en riesgo, pues se ven amenazados por eso en el ejercicio de la búsqueda de información, y nos pone ejemplos vinculados con periodistas que hacen coberturas de conflictos armados, ¿no? Él nos dice, por ejemplo, pensemos el desafío que representa para periodistas que están cubriendo el conflicto entre Israel y Palestina. Cómo el trabajo de los periodistas eso representa más que un trabajo profesional, y es la posibilidad de que la sociedad, de que nosotros, de que nosotras podamos conocer lo que está sucediendo ahí. Pero, dice el doctor Hamelink, el problema es que los gobiernos no quieren que la sociedad, que el mundo se entere de las atrocidades que están cometiendo, y esto pone en riesgo el trabajo de los propios periodistas. Nos comenta el doctor Hamelink que él fue periodista en los años 60, que cubrió conflictos armados y que él pudo tomar conciencia de que los riesgos son enormes. Y nos dice, bueno, el problema actual es que los riesgos se han incrementado, o los desafíos se han incrementado. ¿Por qué razón? Porque hoy es permitido asesinar a un periodista. Y entonces aquí con la maestra Carolina Pacheco estamos viendo un artículo, un informe que presentó la organización Artículo 19 a finales del año pasado en México, que reporta el ataque o agresiones contra 3,000 periodistas en el país, y más del 50% de estos casos corresponden a periodistas que cubren los temas de corrupción y política. Lo que también, y esto pensando eso, habrán estudiantes aquí que quieran estudiar, que quieran enfocarse en periodismo, sea como profesionales o sea como investigadoras, investigadores. Lo que eso nos advierte entonces este punto es que también, dependiendo del área que cubra él o la periodista, es que el riesgo se incrementará. Por ejemplo, nosotras hemos trabajado con mujeres periodistas que hacen cobertura informativa de violencia contra las mujeres y violencia feminicida, y el riesgo que ellas enfrentan incluso pone eso, ¿no? En riesgo su propia integridad, su propia vida.
Now, of course, it is understandable that these factors lead to a problem with the right to receive information. Because as a citizen, certainly in a democracy, you are dependent upon good quality of information if you want to participate in the political realm. But how do you get good information? What happens to our right to receive good information? Are we well informed? Well, we are certainly not well informed by the mainstream conventional media, not even any longer by the New York Times, which was a great newspaper, which is increasingly listening to political forces. The New York Times has decided to follow the Joe Biden line, like, for example, in the Middle East conflict, and no critical information about what the Israelis do, critical information about the Palestinians. So partisan, and that's a very danger for journalism. If you choose parts, as journalists, you should stay a little outside, try to remain neutral, but that's practically impossible around the world. Because the most important media in the world, whether it's television or whether it's newspapers, are controlled by commercial and political forces. And the information you can also, in my country, the Netherlands is a very small and very pleasant country and a very free country. But you don't get any reliable information from our conventional media. And whatever criticism you may have of the social platforms, if you want to really know what's happening also in my country, if you want to know what's happening in the conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, if you want to know what the plans of the NATO are, you have to turn to the social platforms, because the conventional media will not inform you. So that's so much for the right to receive information.
Muy bien. Relacionado con el derecho a recibir información, el principal desafío tiene que ver con el hecho de que la información que producen los grandes medios, las grandes corporaciones, se ve influenciada por sus intereses políticos y económicos. Nos habla del ejemplo del New York Times en nuestro país. Desde luego tenemos ejemplos también de ello. Hemos hablado en la clase sobre la perspectiva de la economía política y la comunicación, que justo nos ayuda a entender cómo es que los intereses políticos y económicos de los propietarios de los medios, o sea, de estas grandes corporaciones, influyen en la calidad de la información que recibimos. Y dice algo muy importante el doctor Hamelink en este punto: la calidad de nuestra ciudadanía depende de la calidad de la información que recibimos. Por lo tanto, debemos involucrarnos y asumir que como parte del ejercicio de nuestros derechos ciudadanos, el asegurarnos, el recibir, el consumir una información veraz es un principio. Y en este punto yo quisiera añadir, por ejemplo, en los casos que acompañamos de violaciones a derechos de mujeres periodistas, muchas veces la forma en la que las corporaciones para las que ellas trabajan se deslindan de su responsabilidad de protegerlas y de eso, garantizarles condiciones de seguridad en su trabajo, es señalando que la razón por la cual ellas son víctimas de violencia es por asuntos personales, no por el trabajo profesional que realizan, lo cual no es así, como dice este informe de artículo 19. Y por lo tanto, la invitación a ustedes es a que tomemos conciencia de que cada vez que se violan los derechos humanos de uno o una periodista, se está violentando nuestro derecho a recibir información, acceder a información. O sea, justo vinculado por este desafío, es importante tomar conciencia que la violencia contra periodistas no nos es ajena, porque viola un principio. He has a question. Adelante. Tijuana.
He reads too much about politics and corruption in Mexico, and I think it's a very good example for this.
Sí.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Let's go to the last component, the right to impart information. And you may wonder, if you have the right to freely express your opinions, why do you need the right to distribute information? Well, that tells you the foresight of the drafters of the Universal Declaration. They said, yes, you may be free to say what you want, but then your government or your municipal government may say, yes, yes, nice guy, he can say whatever he wants. He can even have a demonstration, but he should do the demonstration outside the city and at 3 o'clock in the night. So no one will be there. And in order to avoid that governments could manipulate the times at which you would express opinions, they added this imparting information, which I think is increasingly important and is also under great duress, because it means the freedom to demonstrate. And the freedom to demonstrate is really in danger around the world. I was happy to see on Sunday, I may politically not necessarily agree with the protesters, but they were left alone. That means that this is not a dictatorship. If Mexico was a dictatorship, the Sunday demonstration would not have taken place. In dictatorships, where there's no democracy, demonstrations don't take place. And even in countries where there's democracy, like in my own country, it was extremely difficult to organize demonstrations during the pandemic. If you didn't agree with the measures of the government that were serious violations of human rights, the right to culture, the right to education, the right to mobility, and you wanted to demonstrate, usually the demonstrations were prohibited. Or when you still demonstrated, you got a lot of police after you in that small, peaceful country, Países Bajos, because the government did not want to hear any criticism of its pandemic policies.
Ok, y relacionado con el último principio, el derecho a impartir información, es decir, a difundirla, nos dice el doctor Hamelink, este es un principio que igualmente está en riesgo creciente en todo el mundo porque se vincula directamente con nuestro derecho a la libre manifestación. Lo hemos visto en este país, lo vemos en muchos países, como hay una criminalización de la protesta social y por lo tanto el derecho humano a la libertad de expresión en su conjunto es que se ve desafiado por todos estos, digamos eso, en las circunstancias actuales se ve desafiado más que nunca en la historia.
Now let's add to these 5 components this beautiful Article 19, one historical fact. Because where does it come from? That Article 19 comes from a resolution, Resolution 59. And that number is important because it means it's one of the first resolutions the United Nations is established in 45. And in 47, the Philippine delegation proposes Resolution 57. And that is unanimously accepted by the General Assembly. All countries agree. What does it say? It says the freedom of information is the touchstone of all rights and freedoms to which the United Nations is consecrated. Now, let this sink in. We talk about freedom of information, and we have to realize that in the international community, that right is considered the most important right. And right to education, right to the freedom of religion, right to the freedom from torture, it's all dependent upon the freedom of information. So that means when freedom of information is attacked, and I gave you all the threats against these 5 components worldwide, and we could talk for hours about that, and we could agree and disagree, but generally we will probably agree there's a dangerous climate for the freedom of information. And when that freedom is violated, then the whole building of human rights will collapse. It's that crucial.
Ok. Estoy haciendo mis notas. Ok, entonces se pregunta el doctor Hamelink, ¿de dónde viene el artículo 19? Deriva de la Resolución 59 de las Naciones Unidas, que fue aprobada por unanimidad en 1947 por la Asamblea General de la ONU. De hecho, nos dice el doctor Hamelink, fue una de las primeras resoluciones que aprobó la Organización de las Naciones Unidas a partir de la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos. Nos dice la definición que estableció esta resolución define a la libertad de expresión o libertad de información como la piedra de toque de todas las libertades a las que la Organización de las Naciones Unidas está consagrada. Es decir, que el derecho a la libertad de expresión es considerado como el más importante porque vincula todos los derechos reconocidos en la Declaración Universal. Ejemplos, nuestro derecho a la educación, nuestro derecho a la salud, lo vimos eso durante la pandemia, como el derecho a la información fue crucial para que incluso eso, o sea, pudiéramos hacer la diferencia entre sobrevivir o morir. Y nos dice el doctor Hamelink, nos hace una advertencia muy importante. Si reconocemos a partir de estos desafíos que él ha enlistado que el derecho a la libertad de expresión está bajo ataque, si colapsa este derecho, colapsa toda la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos y colapsaría entonces toda la plataforma que nos hemos dado como humanidad para garantizar el respeto a la dignidad humana.
So freedom of information begins in 47, then it moves to 48, to the Freedom of Information Summit of the United Nations, the first international summit the UN organizes is on freedom of information. From there, Article 19 goes into the Universal Declaration, and then it begins a long journey through the international institutions. Particularly in the 1970s, the theme is extremely important when the non-aligned countries and what was then called the third world countries, they are now called the global south, but in my time, they were called the countries of the tercer mundo. And those countries wanted to have a new information order, in which again, the freedom of all, also of the poor countries to participate in international communication would be strengthened. And I'm very happy to say that I spent in those 70s a couple of years here in this beautiful city of Mexico with the Instituto Latinoamericano de Estudios Transnacionales. So you wonder why I don't speak Spanish, but that was because all my colleagues from all over Latin America only wanted to speak English. They said, we know enough about Spanish, so you speak English, so we can learn English. So I had to speak English, even with President Echeverria, with whom I had a cup of tea. He invited me to speak English because that was better. He wanted to be the Secretary General of the United Nations, and then he had to learn to speak English. So anyway, we wrote many resolutions based on the Universal Declaration for the non-aligned countries. And believe it or not, who was one of my very famous or infamous co-writers? Raúl Castro, the brother of Fidel. Raúl Castro was the Minister of Information. He came regularly to Mexico. We would sit in the night and we would write resolutions that would change the world. And one little anecdotal detail, I learned to smoke Cuban cigars from him and drink whiskey, because Raúl would always say, Cees, if we're going to change the world, that can't be done without a cigar and a glass of whiskey. So that was the ambiance, great enthusiasm. We were going to change the world. Well, it didn't really work that way, but we were naive and optimistic.
Bueno, no crean que esta conferencia promueve el alcohol, ¿eh? Ya hablamos de esta hora de whisky, pero no es la intención. Pero bueno, siempre con una buena cerveza en medio, yo creo que eso se pueden discutir los temas. A ver, lo que nos dice el doctor Hamelink es que a partir de esta resolución de Naciones Unidas, y esto también es importante que entendamos, por eso tenemos que leer su libro, por eso tenemos que estudiar derechos humanos, porque es muy bonito entender eso, la estructura institucional de toda esta plataforma de derechos humanos, empezando por las Naciones Unidas, entender qué papel juega una resolución, por qué es distinta de un tratado, por qué es distinta, qué mecanismos existen para monitorear que sean cumplidos los acuerdos que se establecen en estos documentos, en estos instrumentos. Entonces, nos dice el doctor Hamelink que a partir de la publicación de la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos, la primera cumbre que organizó la Organización de las Naciones Unidas fue en 1948 y fue justamente sobre el derecho a la libertad de expresión. Y en este marco se llamó a la creación del nuevo orden mundial de la información. Eso, quienes estudiamos historia de la comunicación, sabemos a lo que se refieren estos que son hitos en eso, la construcción del derecho humano a comunicar, y nos menciona el doctor Hamelink que a partir de ahí se hicieron varias reuniones con expertos a fin de elaborar resoluciones que fueran poniendo en papel lo que significa el ejercicio no solamente del derecho a la libertad de expresión, sino, como lo hemos visto aquí, el derecho a acceder a los medios de comunicación, a su operación, a difundir información, el derecho a acceder a la información. Entonces, una de estas cumbres se llevó a cabo en México y en este marco el doctor Hamelink con otros expertas de América Latina trabajaron en la elaboración de una resolución. Así que piensen ustedes qué resolución quieren elaborar y a dónde tendremos que ir para sentarnos con otros expertos en distintas materias para elaborarlas.
So that long journey goes through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, through many commissions and many conferences, and you find them all in this book, Communication and Human Rights, which was recently published in Britain. And it ends for the time being in the early 21st century with the World Summit on the Information Society. Now, in all those meetings and all those conferences, there's always three conflicts, three controversies that keep coming back. The first is, yes, nice to have freedom of information, but what do we do with harmful information? Should there be a limit to freedom of information?
Mm.
When people incite others to genocide, should the freedom of information then be limited? I was at the time of the Rwandan genocide, a collaborator of the then Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan. And I knew that a radio station in Kigali sent out messages to incite the Hutus to kill the Tutsis. So people were asked, the radio program would say, there's a little church outside Kigali and there's some Tutsis hiding, go and kill them. And I thought that for me was a limit to the freedom of information. So I said to the Secretary General, let's just bomb the bloody bastards. Let's throw a bomb on the television station. Well, the Secretary General said, personally, I agree with you, but the Security Council will never permit it. So that is a talk that keeps coming back. And you also see that today in the field of, for example, hate speech. Is hate speech a part of being free to say what you think? Or is it so dangerous that it should be stopped? Secondly, the returning conflict is, yes, it's all nice that we have the freedom to speak. But what about the freedom to be listened to? Slowly in communication, and those of you who study communication will know that for a long time we've looked at communication as a one-way street. You only distribute information. But what about the other side? Shouldn't there also be a right to be listened to? And shouldn't we learn to listen? What is the sense of speaking if no one listens? And that became a big international debate. Some people, like I belong to the people who always pleaded for, we should do more about listening. And people should have the right to be listened to. That's part of communication. But then others said, yes, but that's a breach of, let's leave that to the journalists. I remember the Pakistani Minister of Information saying to me, I don't know what you talk about. Why should I listen to the Pakistani people? They're represented in our parliament by politicians that can speak much better. And then I reminded him, of a statement by one of the American presidents, I think it was Woodrow Wilson or another one, that said, there's no argument to claim that the members of parliament say more sensible things than the ordinary people. So that is the second controversy, the role of listening to people and take them seriously in the communication process. And the last one was the eternal controversy about whether citizens should have the right to participate in decision-making about communication. Whether citizens should have a right to also participate in saying what they think is good information and saying what information they want to have. And on the basis of that, I created with the consumer associations in the world a document which is called the People's Communication Charter. And in that charter, we claim the rights of citizens to participate in political and economic decision-making on communication. And that is highly contested, particularly, and that is interesting, by an organization that is in favor of freedom of information, an organization called Article 19. I've always been in deep conflict with them because they don't think that ordinary people ought to be consulted.
Ok. Y bueno, a partir de esta primera cumbre de 1948, nos dice el doctor Hamelink, se sucedieron múltiples reuniones en las que se identificaron tres principales puntos de discusión que han resultado controversiales hasta el día de hoy. Uno, y creo que nos llama a la reflexión, dice él, en estas cumbres, todos estábamos de acuerdo en el reconocimiento y la defensa del derecho a la libertad de expresión, pero la gran pregunta era, ¿qué hacemos con la información peligrosa? O sea, ¿o qué hacemos, por ejemplo, con esto que estamos discutiendo el día de hoy, el discurso de odio, ¿no? ¿Qué hacemos con aquella información que atenta eso contra la dignidad de las personas? ¿Aplica la defensa del derecho a la libertad de expresión en estos casos? Entonces, esta es una pregunta que me parece eso muy importante y que eso nos llevemos para la reflexión o ahora eso en una ronda de diálogo con el doctor Hamelink, me parece que la podemos discutir, ¿no? Porque lo estamos viendo al día de hoy en todas estas plataformas digitales, en videojuegos, en la industria musical, cómo se está legitimando, ¿no? La violación a la dignidad de las personas a través de los contenidos en nombre de defender la libertad de expresión. El segundo desafío o la segunda controversia que él identifica es que todo mundo hablaba y estaba de acuerdo acerca del derecho a expresarnos libremente, pero nadie habla sobre el derecho de las personas a ser escuchadas. ¿Y por qué razón? Porque lo que nos dice el doctor Hamelink, esto representaba para los gobiernos el desafío de reconocer la opinión pública. Entonces, muchos gobiernos lo que respondieron frente a esta pregunta, frente a este desafío fue, bueno, pues ese trabajo ya lo hacen los periodistas, que sean los periodistas los que le den a través de sus notas voz a la ciudadanía y ese conflicto o esa controversia sigue ahí. Y la tercera es que hay quienes como el doctor Hamelink defienden que la ciudadanía debe gozar del derecho a participar en procesos de decisión sobre lo que es la comunicación, la información, el tipo de información que quieren tener. Y entonces él nos pone el ejemplo, lo tenemos aquí en México, de las defensorías de las audiencias. O sea, justamente las defensorías en los medios públicos juegan o se supone fueron creadas para jugar ese papel, aunque no lo jueguen, ¿no? Que es el de que nosotros como ciudadanos podamos señalar al medio de comunicación cuando no estamos de acuerdo con un contenido o cuando queremos proponer un contenido. Entonces, señala el doctor Hamelink, hasta el día de hoy no se reconoce, hay resistencias a reconocer que la ciudadanía podamos participar en los procesos de decisión sobre el tipo de información que queremos consumir en los medios de comunicación.
Now, in this book, and I'm happy to say that I'm negotiating with Siglo XXI to have it quickly translated into Spanish, I proposed the concept of justicia comunicativa, communicative justice. Mm-hmm. To summarize this whole discussion that we're having by saying we are as humans capable of a very special kind of communication. More than any other animal, do we have the capacity for pro-social, compassionate communication. We can care about others in our communication. We have the capacity to let others freely say what they want to say. We have a marvelous communicative capacity, and that should be respected. That's what communicative justice means. So give space for the way in which we as human beings can communicate in a free way, in an egalitarian way, in a respectful way, and in a way that makes people feel at home in their societies.
Muy bonito. Entonces, en este libro que el doctor Hamelink me va a regalar y yo les voy a poder enseñar, that's my present, right? So,
Oy, 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 oy.
Sí, entonces, sí, of course. Ok, entonces su propuesta es la justicia comunicativa. Nos dice el doctor Hamelink, ante estos desafíos, ¿cómo podemos la ciudadanía habilitarnos de recursos, de herramientas para ejercer nuestros derechos, nuestro derecho humano a la comunicación o el derecho humano a comunicar? Entonces, su propuesta es la la justicia comunicativa, que consiste en proponer, impulsar, garantizar una comunicación entre personas basada en el respeto, la igualdad, la libertad y la seguridad. Y el doctor Hamelink, que lo tendrán que ver en su libro y que por cierto lo va a traducir probablemente siglo XXI al español, él desarrolla esta propuesta de la justicia comunicativa como principio para ejercer nuestro derecho humano a comunicar.
Let me conclude with 2 points. First, it's easy to talk about communicative justice, but are we really ready to communicate in that way? Are we really ready to communicate in a way that takes others seriously? Or are we developing around the world individualist societies in which we are mainly interested in ourselves? I call that the selfie societies. You don't even ask someone else to take your picture because you run the risk of having to talk to that person. So you do it yourself with one of these ridiculous sticks, but that avoids communication with others. Are we really willing to communicate with each other? Are we really willing to listen to others? I think we have big mouths and small ears. So we need to learn el arte de escuchar, to really communicate. And I was invited a couple of weeks ago at UAM, and that was really nice because that was a smaller group of students and we did an exercise on listening. I designed a little exercise to check whether you are a good listener or an average listener or bad listeners. And most of these beautiful Mexican students turned out to be rather bad listeners. So they were and one of them said, yes, and I know why it is, because when Mexicans begin to talk, they all talk at the same time. So el arte de escuchar, that's an art that we really need to learn if we want to communicate as we can.
Muy bien. Entonces, a manera de conclusión, eso, el primer punto que coloca el doctor Hamelink es, pregunta él, o más bien dice, es fácil proponer, hacer una propuesta como la de la justicia comunicativa, pero reflexionemos, ¿estamos listos para ejercer la comunicación en esta perspectiva? ¿A qué asistimos en la actualidad? A sociedades crecientemente individualistas y egoístas, y partimos del principio de que la justicia comunicativa implica el pensar en el otro, a eso se refiere el concepto de compasión. Entonces, dice él, si somos sociedades individualistas y egoístas, estas sociedades selfies, ¿no? Y por eso hizo la alusión a esto que hacen todos ustedes, nosotras no, que es el estarse tomando selfies. Pregunta él, ¿es posible ejercer una justicia comunicativa cuando no queremos escuchar al otro, cuando solo estamos enfocados en nosotros mismos? Entonces, dice él, para ejercer la justicia comunicativa se requiere de un principio y es el de aprender a escuchar, aprender el arte de escuchar.
Now, what can we do? Let me suggest some things that we could do. First of all, there's an enormous lack of knowledge about human rights in the world. There's an enormous lack of knowledge about this fundamental article on the freedom of information. I remember being in Cape Town in South Africa after the apartheid politics were over, and Mandela was the president. And I gave a seminar on human rights. which was very touching because human rights was a forbidden term during apartheid.
Mm.
So I talk about human rights, and a young man, a teacher in Soweto, in Joburg, the primary school, says to me, this is the most beautiful day of my life.
Mm.
Tears in his eyes. I never heard that human rights were also for me. And then he said, but are they also for my kids in the school? And I said, yes, everyone means everyone. So those human rights are also for the kids of Soweto. And then he said, then I must run back to my school. And I'm going to talk to all the kids that they have fundamental human rights. Now, mind you, that doesn't necessarily change the world overnight, but it's an enormous tool of empowerment to realize that you are taken seriously by the international community. You matter. You're part of it. And when someone violates your human rights, it's not your fault. What people often tend to think, it's probably my fault because I'm poor. No, it's not your fault. The other trespasses your right. The other is a criminal and should stand trial in the international courts of human rights. So human rights education is extremely important. It's a fantastic tool of empowering people. So we should teach human rights to journalists, because when journalists write about human rights, it's usually wrong. We should teach human rights to judges. Most of the judiciary systems in the world, judges and lawyers, have very little knowledge about human rights. And we should primarily teach it to children, to the kids, because the ones who understand human rights better than any other group are the small kids. Talk to kids of 6 or 7, they are the best philosophers. They can still think freely. They're not yet domesticated and manipulated by the educational system. So talk to them about human rights education.
Muy bien. Entonces, cierra su intervención preguntando qué podemos hacer. Advierte con preocupación que hay un enorme vacío de conocimiento de los derechos humanos en el mundo y en particular del artículo 19. Y el doctor Hamelink alude a eso, a un ejercicio que promovemos en nuestro seminario, que es el de apropiarnos de los derechos humanos, y por eso tenemos que estudiarlos. Él dice, la educación en derechos humanos es fundamental, y nos cuenta, ya ven cómo ha viajado el doctor Hamelink, ¿no? O sea, ha estado en Ruanda, ha estado en México, ha estado en Sudáfrica, después del apartheid, y él nos narra una anécdota eso muy conmovedora de eso, una conferencia, una charla que tuvo en el Soweto, que es el barrio en la capital, donde tenían confinada a toda la comunidad negra durante el apartheid. Entonces, cuando terminó el profesor Hamelink su intervención, un hombre le dijo que estaba muy conmovido, que era el día más importante de su vida, porque ahí aprendió que él tenía también derechos humanos. Entonces, nos dice el doctor Hamelink, si estudiamos derechos humanos, y lo dice Marcela Lagarde también, tenemos que estudiar derechos humanos para apropiarnos de ello, porque en la medida en que estudiemos, entonces sabremos cuáles son los derechos humanos que son inherentes a nuestra condición humana y que son la base del ejercicio, el respeto a nuestra dignidad. Dice él, si ustedes estudian derechos humanos y toman conciencia de ellos, serán tomados en cuenta seriamente por la comunidad internacional. Por lo tanto, la responsabilidad de nuestras instituciones, y la asumimos en esta universidad, es impulsar una educación en derechos humanos. Hay que enseñarlos.
Lastly, the Human Rights Declaration has a concept of the human being. It's based on a concept of who we are. And that concept is that we are free. As human beings, the most fundamental characteristic is our freedom. And as the French philosopher Michel Foucault says, we are, and that's a philosophical word, we are ontologically free. It's part of who we are. That is also what makes us so dangerous for dictators and tyrants. Because please always realize that power is dependent upon whether we use our freedom. The dictator leads a very troubled life, because the dictator will realize that every day we may say, hey, we don't accept it any longer. We are free to determine our own destiny. We can go into submission and in servitude. And in the 16th century, philosopher La Boétie writes about voluntary servitude. We often offer ourselves freely as slaves. We submit to the power of the dictator. And Michel Foucault says, no. Since we are free, we have to change that for voluntary inservitude, disobedience. And that's why at the end of this lecture, I'd like to dedicate it not only to Eleanor and to my sister Marion, but to another woman who in literary history was the first ever free woman. Some of you may remember the story in the Old Testament, Eva. I talk about Eva. Eva who disobeyed the orders of God. And she ate from the tree that gave her knowledge. So Eva was disobedient. Foucault would have loved her. She was disobedient, and as a result, she was thrown out of the paradise. But that means she's the first free woman. Her disobedience brought her freedom. Yes, no longer in paradise. Paradise is wonderful, but it's not free. In paradise, you're told how to live. It's determined by others. So be disobedient. Let yourself be thrown out of paradise, and let our lives be led as the agents of our own destiny. We can realize the imagination of Eleanor Roosevelt. And since we can, we should do that. You should do that because you can. And enjoy that imagination of free lives. And thank you very much.
Bueno, y finalmente dice el doctor Hamelink que la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos elabora un concepto, una definición, perdón, de lo que es ser humano. Y ese concepto identifica que la característica más importante del ser humano es la libertad. Nos dice, es parte inherente de lo que somos y de quienes somos. Y por lo tanto, la invitación del doctor Hamelink y eso aludiendo a Eva, esta mujer que dice el doctor Hamelink, fue la primera mujer y el primer ser humano en la historia que ejerció su libertad. ¿Y cómo la ejerció? Desobedeciendo a las reglas establecidas por Dios para, bueno, a partir del ejercicio de su libertad, ser echada. Y entonces la invitación del doctor Hamelink a ustedes es el de que sean desobedientes, que los echen del paraíso y que vivan libres, pero con responsabilidad y entendiendo que tenemos un lugar en el mundo y que nuestro lugar tiene que ver con beneficiar a la sociedad. Eso lo añade su maestra, pero yo creo que está implícito también en la mente de nuestro amigo Cees Hamelink. Así que le agradecemos y pues queremos abrir el micrófono ahora. Creo que son ideas muy sugerentes las que ha colocado, además con mucha sabiduría. I must say that you are one of the wisest teachers we have had, not only me. le digo que debo reconocer que es uno de los profesores más sabios, no solamente inteligentes y que conocen muchas cosas y que han viajado un montón, sino tiene mucha sabiduría el doctor Hamelink. Entonces, pues eso, que estamos muy agradecidos. Así que, ¿quieren comentar algo? Insisto, hay muchas ideas acá, y todas aluden a nuestra responsabilidad. ¿Qué pasa con esto del ejercicio de la libertad de expresión? Pensamos que ejercer discurso de odio es también ejercer la libertad de expresión. ¿Qué pensamos acerca de cómo podemos impulsar una ciudadanía comunicativa cuando estamos ensimismados en tomarnos selfies y en solo eso, atender a nuestros deseos individuales? ¿Opiniones? ¿Sí? ¿Quieres el micrófono? Ah, bueno, está el doctor. Says, do you listen?
Yes,
Okay, great.
I walk up to her.
Okay.
I'd like to give, and I can give you my microphone. Why not share it? Life is all about sharing.
Well, thanks. Well, you're a journalist, but when the information that you want is not on traditional media, what do you do to get that information that you want? Like in this example of the conflict of Ukraine and Russia, you get interviews with people that live in that conflict, or what do you do to get that information that you want or need?
The best information I get about that conflict in Eastern Europe comes, interestingly enough, from the United States. Comes from Amy Goodman, who does a beautiful television program called Democracy Now!, with a lot of critical information and critical comments. And it comes from the Chris Hedges report. Chris Hedges was a journalist, famous international journalist with the New York Times, but he left the New York Times because he was no longer happy with the censorship of that newspaper. He began his own network with a lot of interesting information. But you see, it's a good question, because one day I said to my students in Amsterdam, if you want to be really well informed about the world, you should read every day at least 4 Dutch newspapers, 4 international newspapers. You should watch television from all over the world, Al Jazeera, BBC, Deutsche Welle. You should watch all the alternative sites, Interpress Service, other news, the social platforms, because then only you can have such a richness of information that you can make up your own mind. Because at the end of the day, you as a receiver have to make up your own mind, comparing all these different sources. But it was not a very successful experiment, because after 3 days, one of the students came to me and he said, we have tried this, but we get raving mad. All that information, we get an information overload. So please give us 2 sources. Of course, 2 sources is not enough. If you really want to be well informed, you have to go to, and there's a richness of sources. That's also what I like about your country. I'm amazed about the many social platforms with very good professional journalists. And you have the classical media, you can read El Universal if you want, you can watch television news. I don't think that's necessarily the best source of information, but you can also watch Los Periodistas or Estulin or other guys that you may agree or disagree with, but they're all there. So there's no lack of critical information that you can get. But then, of course, then the problem is, then you need to learn, and that's what I hope is also happening here in the communication studies department. Then you learn how to make up your own mind. And that's, in addition to human rights education, I think what we really need, something that was very popular in the 1970s. It's called media education. Because people may be streetwise, but they should also be media-wise. And particularly young kids should become information literate. They can read and write, but they usually don't know how to deal with newspapers, television programs. And you can teach in human rights education how to realize that the source is unreliable, how to read a news communique. Like, for example, if the Israeli Defense Forces accuse the United Nations Relief Agency to be part of the Hamas attack. That may be true, maybe not true, but you have to read the press communique, the press release, and you have to ask, where does it come from? Who are the sources? Do they have an interest in telling the story in a special way? Because we are storytellers as journalists. You tell stories from different perspectives. And you find that when you critically read a newspaper article or look at the television program, you begin to see when you ask, but is it true? Where does it come from? Are arguments used? I've seen in my life thousands of press releases with very strong statements without an argument. You would get nowhere in a court case because the judge would say, where are the arguments? Where is the evidence? You can't just accuse someone of killing someone else without having a dead body. So you need to have evidence, and that can be taught. And I want to have a very strong plea also here with you that we spend lots of attention and time and money, Carolina, on educating young kids. Needs to begin in the schools, in what we call in your basic schools, so the primary schools. Start as early as possible. Kids will understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. It says there are two hands there and one here.
Oh. You need microphone.
Yeah, thanks.
Ah,
I have a real opinion about, you say that we need to learn to speak and others, and that my English is not the best, so I will try that. No te preocupes,
Como quieras, tú tranquilo, tómate tu tiempo. Nos vamos a la cerveza.
Si no es Spanish, ya.
Fuera de la universidad.
You say that we need to learn how to listen to others. So I think this is real. And in our generation, actually, many people think that we don't want that we can listen to another person to talk about human rights if that person is white, cisgender, heterosexual, straight, because but this is because we are in our generation privileged.
Sí.
Privileged people. So I think this is not
An obstacle.
I think that's a really bad, I don't know. Ok, lo voy a decir en español. Creo que eso es un gran prejuicio porque tal vez esta gente privilegiada no debería ser como tomada como personas que tal vez no pueden hablar de estos temas por el simple hecho de que nunca lo han vivido. Tal vez una persona tipo like Martin Luther King en su momento, en español ya,
Al principio, para que se la podamos sintetizar. Sí.
Acerca de los derechos de las personas afrodescendientes y todo el mundo lo aplaudió. Pero esta lucha es una lucha que sigue constante, que no se terminó, pero siento que como generación tal vez sí deberíamos ser un poquito más abiertos hacia estas personas que tal vez no sé, generaciones, poblaciones que a lo mejor son marginadas o tienen problemas con los negros, con de la comunidad LGBT. Tal vez estas personas nacieron siendo hombres heterosexuales, cisgéneros, blancos y todo esto que podríamos considerar un privilegio. Y no sé, siento que nuestra generación múltiples veces trata de dar sus opiniones simplemente por el hecho de no pertenecer a estas poblaciones vulnerables, lo que a mi parecer es una tontería. Porque, o sea, el hecho de que seas una persona completamente diferente a aquellas que han sufrido, te quita la capacidad de conocer acerca de ello. No sé, yo puedo hablar sobre personas heterosexuales, no tengo que ser heterosexual para hacerlo. O puedo hablar sobre privilegios de gente, no sé, estadounidense. Si ya lo estudié, no tengo por qué ser una persona estadounidense para saberlo. No voy a hablar de ello porque es como que decía, pero no sé, algo, es que me falta esto. Hay que aprender a escuchar a todos los demás y vale, bueno, yo le agradezco a usted, la verdad, por haber tocado este punto, porque es algo que siento yo que como generación nos falta mucho. O sea, si antes ya les faltaba a la generación anterior, ahora nuestra generación lo está cambiando, siento yo.
Muchas gracias. What he says is that he agrees with you on the art to listen, and it goes through respecting the specific, the individual condition of each one. I mean, because what he says is that currently within his generation, people uses to disqualify the other, saying that you are European, white, middle class men, heterosexual, blah, 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 then you don't have the right to give an opinion about my society. And he says that based on the principle of listening, it's important to respect each one's opinion. Yeah. Okay, allá.
Yo tengo una pregunta, la voy a decir en español. ¿Qué podemos hacer en este momento cuando los derechos humanos ya no son suficientes para salvar las vidas? O sea, en este contexto en esta época contemporánea hay un genocidio en casa. ¿Y qué podemos hacer para justificar que los derechos humanos funcionen cuando no están funcionando hoy? Esa es la pregunta. So I'm going to translate. So what can we do well today to say and to fix how fundamental rights are not enough to save lives, to protect humans? Because today we're living a genocide in Gaza. They're not enough. They're simply not enough. What can you do? That's what classmate asked.
No, that's the $1,000 question, of course. What can we do? And there's one issue that brings that to me, which I didn't address in the lecture. Human rights are supposed to be protected by the international community, but they're not. And that's where we have a real problem. And I say it with a level of pain because I worked so long with and for the United Nations. But the United Nations is not a good guardian of our rights. They failed totally in Eastern Europe, and they now fail again in the Middle East. Well, USAID is basically, an arm of the Central Intelligence Agency. And many of the USAID people have been on the payroll. As a matter of fact, some of your presidents in the past have also been on the payroll of the CIA. The core problem is that the United Nations was meant as an association of people. That's what the Charter says, we the people. But the United Nations never became the people. It became an association of states. And states have never really wanted, as I said in the beginning, the US government never really wanted the Universal Declaration, because they want to have their own control over their own citizens. And from the beginning, there's a flaw in the human rights system that the governments have insisted on making exemptions, that in a state of public disorder or in a state of war, they want to have the right to curtail your freedom of opinion. Now, that has always puzzled me because if you have fundamental rights, they're fundamental or they're not fundamental. You can't have a little bit fundamental, just like you can't be a little bit pregnant. You're pregnant or not pregnant. You can't be a little bit. So fundamental has to be taken seriously. Fundamental means under all circumstances do we take these rights seriously. Well, then you, as you talk about the generation, but your generation has an enormous responsibility. Because you are the generation that will have to transform the United Nations. We need an international system of monitoring and controlling, observing and protecting human rights. We don't have that today. The UN is incapable of doing that. So we should reinvent the United Nations. And I'm quite willing to say my generation maybe didn't do a very good job, so Daddy is really apologetic. I'm very sorry that we left you this heritage, but now it's your world. The planet is yours. And please realize that you are the only ones who can make this planet a better place. And please realize that your generation should be far more involved, as far as I'm concerned, in that. Because whenever there are big meetings in the world, like, for example, about the environment, it's usually meetings of all people that are on their way out. I always say to my students, you go to this, I see this little sign that says Salida. And at my age, you do that. But you're still at the entrance. So please, do whatever you can and discuss that with each other and discuss that with your teachers. Make programs. Try to reinvent. Because you speak very well, you should become the next Secretary General of the United Nations. Or you? Are you willing? Are you offering? So, but I have a strong belief, and that's why I like to be here today, that I'm very grateful for the invitation from Aimee and Carolina, because I like to talk with you, and I like to listen to you, because you are also my hope for the future.
First of all, thank you for all this information. It's very helpful. And my question is kind of similar to the last one, but it's about the situation in our country. Because when Professor Aimee said that journalists are being murdered, and then she mentioned that 50% who were murdered work on political journalists, you say, yes, but not by the government. And I can't help but think, isn't that worse? Because the fact that journalists are being murdered, for me, means that the government is not doing their job correctly or in the way they should do. And my question is, what do you think is the solution? Because you talk about human rights education, and that is a good solution, but it is the only one, or a new law, or what could happen for this situation?
But you need to realize, I mean, yes, if a government doesn't do its job, that's maybe the case. But how, if I look at the Mexican society, if you want to go after people who are killing others because of corruption, the killers are probably the corrupt ones. They don't want the corruption to be exposed. But how to go after them if you have to deal with a thoroughly corrupt judicial system? I mean, I've been really feeling very ill at ease to know when I talk to Mexican lawyers and I hear beautiful legal arguments and they say, but the argument will play no role when the judge is bought. I'm coming from a country where all kinds of things are wrong. But one thing is impossible, that the judge would be bought. The judicial system is absolutely not corrupt. And that's great because you need to have at least one system that you can rely on, that they will not be prejudiced. So to deal with the corrupt judicial system and to deal with the corrupt police system. Now, your president is in deep, deep trouble because if he doesn't trust the police, then he calls for the army. And then people said, yeah, but he likes war. So it's a very complicated situation. And I would also think that I think Mexico is on the right way internationally. I find a lot of positive comments internationally, also from my own government and other governments, about what's happening in this country. But it's a long way. You come after decades of enormous corruption. And to repair that, then 6 years is not enough. You cannot expect any president to do that in 6 years. It needs much more time. And it needs all of you. It needs the whole society. Because the problem with corruption is, there's a beautiful network documentary that you should watch. It's called O Mecanismo. That's about the corruption in Brazil. And the documentary shows you that corruption slowly goes to all layers of society. Initially is only the top. But slowly, they are the role models. If you are a president or a president of a judicial court, you should be absolutely not corrupt. You are a role model. But if the role model doesn't function well, then others in society think I might as well also be a little bit I might also be a bit corrupt and accept some money. And little officials in little offices say, well, I can arrange that passport for you, but leave a little money. And the police guy who stops you, who says, well, I can take you to the station, but then I have to keep you there the whole day, but you can also keep. And then what that police guy that I'm talking about, he handed me his law book. And he asked me to put the money in the law book. Now that's the lowest you can get. But that's not irresolvable. I think in a way, and I was very happy that the one I would have expected to be far more critical of the economy of this country, Carlos Slim, was in that long interview very complimentary. I said, we're doing very well. But then he's also one of the few ones who pays taxes. That's also interesting. So I think there's many people in many countries that don't want to pay taxes and get very worried when the government says, hey, and that happens all over the world. It happens also in my country. The big transnational corporations in the Netherlands try to evade paying taxes, which normal citizens can't. So, but when there's a government that says, now you pay your taxes, they get all in arms, and it is a big protest. But I think it is all repairable. But maybe you should not listen to me because I'm the eternal optimist. That is what the Secretary General Kofi Annan sometimes said to me. He said, Cees, you are an incurable romantic optimist. But that's the only way I think we can live. Can we live with pessimism? No, then we become suicidal. We have to retain the hope that in spite of all the problems and all the disagreements that we may have about journalists or whatever, but that on the long run, this will also be a sane society. And mind you, Mexico has always been the example for the whole of America Latina. When I was here in the 70s, all the other countries always looked up at Mexico. Mexico was a role model, and it should be that again. And whether you like the current president or the next president, but you have to make the society. It's not the presidents, it's not the tyrants, because you're free human beings. You can make Mexico one of the most beautiful societies. There's a Dutch song, you should see that. We have a Dutch singer who sings, oh, I go to Mexico, I never go home again. It's paradise on earth. Now, try to make it, because there's many, and as Jorge Borges, the famous writer, once wrote, every day has its moments of paradise. And I think Mexico has a lot of moments of paradise. So
this was a moment.
huh?
This was a moment.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Ok, bueno, cerramos solamente un punteo. Dijo el doctor Hamelink que la ONU no cumple más su responsabilidad de proteger los derechos humanos porque se ve influenciada por intereses económicos y políticos y que por lo tanto ustedes tienen en sus manos la responsabilidad de devolverle la densidad política a estas instituciones para que garanticen la protección de nuestros derechos humanos. Y bueno, tiene su opinión sobre eso, los desafíos que enfrentan los periodistas en el país, eso en el contexto actual. Lo que al final dice el doctor Hamelink, y yo creo que todos estamos de acuerdo, es que México, pese a las circunstancias, es un paraíso. Y dice él, eso a México no lo determina un gobierno, a México lo determina su ciudadanía. Ustedes tienen y viven en un país en serio extraordinario y nuestra responsabilidad entonces es eso, trabajar y ojalá que esta conferencia tan bonita, tan maravillosa, nos dice el doctor Hamelink, cada día encuentren su momento de paraíso. Yo creo que acabamos de tener un momento de paraíso y además eso que lo compartamos tantas personas es maravilloso y pues eso, muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much, Cees. Muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a nuestra facultad. A selfie, please. One selfie. Ahí quédense. Ven acá. Vente, Caro. A ver, ustedes quédense ahí.